Hello, I'm Dean Ray Johnson, and this is a board game textbook, How to Play Video for Aeterna, a game by Martin Wallace, published by Ergo Ludo Editions and Ares Games. In Aeterna, each player controls a family in ancient Rome, and like most ancient Roman families, you want everyone to think that your family is the best family. So you're building things and doing politics and otherwise making sure that everyone knows your name. Eterna is a game for 2 to 4 players where you compete to earn the most victory points, which this game calls prestige points, the laurel icon here. A game of Eterna plays over 3 rounds, which are called eras. Each era has an actions phase where the players take turns taking actions until everyone passes for the round. The most important action might be the action to influence a hill. There are 7 hills on the game board that look like this. You can pay to place one of your citizen tokens on a hill, and there are spaces for multiple players to place citizens here. At the end of the era, players score these prestige points based on who had the most citizens on the hill and who placed their citizens here first. So the player that controls the first base scores 7 prestige points at the end of the era, and 4 points for second and 3 points for third. The hills can also change during the game. You can take an action to place a building on a hill, and this gives more bonuses to whoever controls the first base of the hill. But then at the end of each era, the hills with the most citizens on them get devastated. Overpopulation leads to unrest and deterioration, and you destroy the top scoring space of that hill. So the more that people want to fight for a certain hill, the worse that hill becomes. Each era of Eterna also starts with a card draft. At the start of each era, you draw a hand of 5 cards. You choose one of those cards to keep. You pass the other 4 cards to the player on your left. The player on your right passes you their leftover cards. And then you choose one of those cards and pass the rest. And you keep going until you have a hand of 4 cards for the era. These cards are your main source of resources and other bonuses. Like this monument card says, you pay money and stone to play this card. The money resource is called Ore, but I'm just going to call it money for this video. After you play a card, you get everything on the bottom of the card. This card gives you a discount to certain actions for the rest of the game. It scores 1 point at the end of the game, and you immediately gain these rewards in these other spaces. And each card has a color marked on one of the 7 spaces here. You get bonuses for playing cards of the same color or building sets of different colors. And even if you can't play a card in your hand, you can discard any card for a wild bonus, like extra stone or wheat tokens. So you might draft cards that your opponents wanted to play, but then just discard them to get money and stone for the cards that you want to play. I also want to quickly show you the unrest track. When you gain points of unrest, you move up this track. You might gain unrest if you control a hill when that hill gets devastated, or if you play a province card that makes the locals angry at you. And unrest makes your life harder. Like if your token is here at the end of the era, then you need to pay the penalty on this token or you gain a doom token. If you end an era here, then you need to pay the penalties on both of these tokens, and you gain a doom token for any that you don't pay. At the end of the game, you look at the points penalty on the same space as your unrest token. But then for each doom token you've gained during the game, you advance to the next penalty on the track, and then you lose the points on that space. If your unrest and doom tokens push you into the last penalty space, then you lose all of your prestige points. You're getting stabbed on the floor of the Senate, and no one will save you. So you have to balance big rewards versus making your subjects angry enough to stab you. And so the game ends after 3 eras. You score bonus points for the cards that you've played and your leftover resources, and you lose points from the unrest track. The player with the most prestige points will see their family's name written in the most history books and win the game. So I'll start with setup. I'm not going to teach any rules during setup. To skip the setup, check the video timeline and go over to the next chapter. Let's start with the player setup. Each player chooses a color and takes a player board of that color and a player aid card. Each player starts with 2 money tokens, 1 stone token, 2 citizen tokens in their own player color, and 5 wheat tokens. This big wheat token is worth 3 wheat. There's little icons on the player board, like this little stone icon here, so you keep all of your stone in this area. And you should also have these 3 tokens in your player color, which will go on the main board in just a second. Then there's a few other things that go on the game board. I'm going to zoom in on the bottom left corner of the board. First, there's an area here with 4 spaces on them. If you're playing with 2 or 3 players, then you find the pass board that has 2 or 3 spaces on it and you cover that area. Then you place each player's obelisk token on a random space on the top row for the random first player turn order. Then you look at the unrest track. You place a random unrest token face up on the 4 red spaces on this track. Then each player places their laurel counter on 0 on the prestige points track and the torches counter on 0 of the unrest track. And then there's this ship counter. You place it on the first space of this track in the middle. This ship tracks the different phases of each era. And that's all on that corner of the board. Then you make a supply beside the board of all of the other tokens, including the player's unused citizen tokens. There's 3 types of building tokens. You place one of each of these on the spaces in the middle of the board. And last are the decks of cards. All of the cards say Era 1, 2, or 3 on the back. The brown back cards either have a pillar symbol in the corner or a sword symbol in the corner. The blue backed cards all have a personality on the front. You first shuffle 9 different decks of cards. All of the Era 1 pillar cards together, all of the Era 2 pillar cards together, all of the Era 3 pillar cards together, and then 3 separate decks for the other 2 types of cards. There's a small board that looks like this that has Era 2 on the corner here. You place the brown column, brown sword, and blue decks for Era 2 in these 3 slots, like the icons shown on the slots. There's another board like this for the Era 3 decks. So you set these boards up and then set all of the Era 2 and Era 3 cards aside for later. From the Era 1 cards, each player draws 3 pillar cards and 2 sword cards. You're going to draft those cards in the first era. From the blue Era 1 cards, you draw 2 of them and place them face up on the top left corner of the board. In a 2-player game, you only place 1 of these cards. The rest of the Era 1 cards don't get used. You can return them to the box. So, for the first lesson, let's quickly look at the rewards and resources. Your 2 biggest goals are to play these cards from your hand and to win these hills at the end of each era. You start the game with a player board and the resources that you see here. You start with 1 stone and 2 money, which mostly help pay the costs for monument cards. You start with 2 citizens, which you can spend to pay the cost of province cards. You can also place citizens on the hills, and you sometimes pay wheat to place citizens on the hills. When you score the hills at the end of each era, you take back all of your citizens from the board, and then you need to pay a wheat for each citizen in your player board, or you take a penalty. By the way, this big wheat token here is worth 3 wheat each. There's a few other things you can do with money and stone, but those are your 4 biggest concerns. You want money and stone for some cards, citizens for other cards, and going to the hills, and wheat to pay for the hills and to feed your citizens at the end of each era. Of course, you want to use those resources to score prestige points. When you gain or lose prestige points, you move your laurel token that many spaces forward or backward on the points track. Like when you place this province card, you pay 2 citizens to pay the card's cost back to the supply, and at the end of the game, the card scores 1 prestige point. Everything else on the card you gain right away, but you count the prestige points at the end of the game. Province cards tend to give you a lot of rewards, but you also gain a lot of unrest from the land that you've just occupied. Whenever you gain or lose unrest, you move your token that many spaces up or down on this track. At the end of each era, you're going to look at your token on this track and look at each penalty token that's on your space or below it. So if you have 5 unrest, you would pay 1 wheat, 1 stone, and 2 money for this token, and 1 stone and 6 money for this token. You can choose to not pay for a token, but you take a doom token for each penalty that you don't pay. Doom tokens are like unrest that will catch up to you later. At the end of the game, you lose prestige points, based on where your unrest token is at. So let's say you didn't pay for either of these penalties. So you got 2 doom tokens. And then at some point during the game, you found a way to get back down to 1 unrest. So at the end of the game, you end up here and you lose 1 prestige point. But then these 2 doom tokens move you to -3, -6 prestige points. Each doom moves you up 1 penalty, not just 1 square space on the track. And now let's do some math. What happens if you end the game at 0 unrest, but you have 7 doom tokens? Then you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And anyone who ends on this penalty loses the game. So don't let your unrest get too out of control there. One other thing with unrest, if you look on the track, there's a -1 prestige sign here. Anytime you would go above 10 unrest, then you stop at 10 and you lose 1 prestige point for each unrest you would have gained above 10. Down here, it says +1 prestige max. So if you would drop below 0 unrest, then you stop at 0 and gain exactly 1 prestige point, no matter how much unrest you lost. So during the game, you can use your turn to move a citizen from your player board to a hill. I showed you the rewards first because the hills deal with citizens, wheat, and unrest. There are 7 hills on the board, but in a 3-player game, only 5 of the hills will have these reward tokens on them. So those are the only hills that get used in that game, and only 3 hills in a 2-player game. So you take an action to place a citizen on a space. The first citizen on a hill goes in the space on the left, and you must pay 2 wheat to place it. The first citizen also gets to choose one of the 3 reward tiles on the hill. So the green player paid 2 wheat to take the first space. Then green could choose this reward token. You slide it down to show that you used it. And green gains 2 wheat tokens from this reward. You see a thumbs down now, and no one else can use that reward for the rest of the era. The second citizen on a hill costs 1 wheat. If the same player plays the second citizen, then they stack their citizens in the same space, and they choose a reward token. If another player does it, then they take the next space to the right, and they choose a reward token. Yellow could choose this reward to lose 2 unrest, and now that reward is thumbs down. Now this third place has a 4-player mark under it, so you can only use the third space in a 4-player game. So if it's a 3-player game with green, yellow, and blue, then blue is locked out of this hill. Green and yellow can keep placing citizens on the spaces that they're already on, but blue would be stuck. In a 4-player game, blue could place the third citizen, which costs no wheat. And then they take this last reward token. This is a special reward about playing an extra card that I'll come back to later, and they slide that token down. And now these 3 players can keep playing citizens to the hill. It costs no wheat, but the 3 reward tokens are used up, so you don't get any more rewards here. You also move up in ranks when you have more citizens than the player on your left. So blue puts another citizen here. They now have 2 versus 1 on yellow, so they get to switch places. And then they immediately have 2 versus 1 versus green, and so they switch places again and take the top spot. So now let's look at what all happens to this hill at the end of the era. We do 4 things at the end of the era. First, we score each hill. On this hill, blue is the prefect, the player in the top spot, and so they score 7 prestige points. Green scores 4 points for the second space, and yellow scores 3 points for the third space. These rewards are one of your biggest sources of prestige points during the game. After this is Devastation. Devastation is complicated, so I'm just going to overview it right now. I'll explain it again when I do all of the steps of the era. Basically, you count the number of citizens on every hill on the board, like the 4 citizens here, and you figure out which hills have the most citizens. Those hills get ruined by overcrowding and local struggles. You cover their top score with a token. And then the prefect of this hill gains 2 unrest, because everyone remembers who was in charge when the property values went down. Then in the next era, the prefect of this hill is only going to score 4 points and 3 points for second. So, part 3 is buildings. There's an action on the board that lets you place or pay stone to place a building on a hill. A hill can have one of each type of building on it. So if this hill has an aqueduct building on it, then the blue player would also gain 2 wheat. The prefect of the hill gains whatever reward is under the building, either 2 points, 2 wheat, or lose 2 unrest. And the last step here is all of the citizens go back to their owner's player boards. And remember that you need to feed wheat to those citizens in a later step of the era. So you score points, you make some hills worse, you score buildings for each hill's prefect, and you take the citizens back. So the game's other big action is playing cards from your hand. The cards provide all of the different resources as well as prestige points and unique bonuses. So let's talk about the cards. At the start of each era, you draw 5 cards of that era. You get 3 monument cards with the column icon, and you get 2 province cards with this sword icon. You can also see that there's a Roman numeral 2 here for era 2 and a Roman numeral 3 here for era 3 to mark the era. And notice that the monument cards cost money and stone, and the province cards cost citizens. So during setup, you give everyone 3 Era 1 monument cards and 2 Era 1 province cards, and then you draft those cards. At the start of Era 1, you pick one of the 5 cards in your hand, place it face down in front of you, and pass the other 4 cards to the player on your left. Then you take the 4 cards from the player on your right, place one face down, pass the others to the left. You repeat that until you have 4 cards face down, and those 4 cards go into your hand for this era. The 5th card, the last card in each hand that was passed around, you place those cards face up on these spaces on the right side of the board. The only thing you can do with these cards is that there are some reward tokens on hills that have this card icon. When you gain this reward, you can immediately play one of these cards, but you still need to pay the card's cost. So that can go away. Then during the era, one action you can take is to play a card from your hand. You must pay the cost in the top left, returning those resources to the supply. Then the monument cards have a banner here. If there's an hourglass icon here, then it's a permanent effect that affects you for the rest of the game, like this banner reduces the cost to pay for province cards. If it's a bolt icon, then it's an instant bonus that you gain one time immediately. And if it's a rotation icon, then it's an activation bonus. It's a reward that you can use one time per era. When you use the card, you rotate it to show that you used it for that era. Then you look at the row underneath that. If there's prestige points here, then you ignore that for now. You score them at end of the game. So this card is pay 9 money and 1 stone, get this ability, get 1 point at the end of the game, gain 1 citizen and 1 wheat token now, and lose 1 unrest point. And then if I pull this province card over here quickly, this card says you pay 2 citizens, you gain 1 point at end of game, you gain money, stone, and wheat, but you also gain 4 unrest. Because people don't like to be occupied, strangely enough. Also, let's look at your player board quickly. Your player board has icons to place your rotation cards to the left side of your player board. Your permanent cards go above your player board, and your instant cards go to the right side of your player board. And you can play your province cards with the instant cards. Also, each card has a type, which is one of the 7 colored arches at the bottom of the card. You get bonuses for playing cards of the same type or all different types. When you play a card, you gain 1 money for each card that you already had of the same type. If you see the yellow card that's under the arch here, that's the money icon. So you play this green type card here. The next time you play a green type card, you get 1 bonus money from that green card that you had in play. When you play a third green type card, you get 2 money from the other 2 green cards that you had in play, and so on. And I'll explain these personality cards in the next lesson. I just want to mention that they have this 7th type of arch here. You don't get money when you pay multiples of these cards because it doesn't have the money icon in the arch. Then sets of different cards score bonus points. At the end of the game, you stack your cards into sets of different types. If you can make a stack of 7 different cards like this, it scores 9 bonus points. A stack of 6 different cards scores 3 bonus points. And then at the end of each era, you discard all of the unplayed cards in your hand. So if you draft an Era 1 card and you don't play it in Era 1, then it's gone. You can't get it back. But you get free bonuses when you discard a card. This is the player aid card. If you see this tan stripe on the card, there's an infinity symbol here and an X card here. That means that at any time you can discard any card from your hand to get a citizen and 2 money, or 2 wheat, or 1 stone, or lose 2 unrest. This doesn't use your turn. You can do this as a free action before or after the main action on your turn. And this is the rotation icon. This reminds you that you can use an activation card once per era by rotating the card, also as a free action on your turn. So, those are the cards in your hand. You draft 4 of those cards at the start of the era. As long as we're looking at the player aid card, let's talk about the other actions that you can take on your turn. Your player aid shows 5 things you can do on your turn. You've seen play a column or sword card from your hand, or pay 2, 1, or 0 wheat to place a citizen on a hill. Now let's look at the other 3 actions. First, at the start of each era, you put 2 personality cards on the board. In a 2-player game, there's only 1 of these cards on the board. As an action, you can pay the cost on the corner of a personality card, resolve the card's effect, take the card, and place it with your instant cards. So Romulus here says, for each hill on the board where you're the prefect, where your citizen is in the top spot, you lose 2 unrest and you gain 1 wheat token. You need to be able to gain the personality's reward at least once, so you can't play Romulus unless you're the prefect of at least 1 hill. And remember, these cards are where you get the 7th type of cards for building sets of different cards at end of the game. Each personality can only be used by 1 player each era, so if you want a personality card, you gotta make sure you can use it before anyone else can. The next action is constructing a building. When you score the hills at the end of the era, the prefect of the hill gets a bonus for every building on the hill. You also just get 3 prestige points for constructing a building. In each era, there's 1 building of each type in the center area of the board. This square on your player aid shows the action. You pay 1 stone, you score 3 prestige points, and you place 1 of your citizens on the space beside that building. Then you place that building on a hill. It needs to be one of the active hills with the reward tokens on it, and it can't be a hill that already has a building of that type. And then at the end of the era, you get back all of your citizens that are on the board, including the citizens on the hills and on the building actions. The last action you can do is pass for the era. Passing can score points and give you better player order for the next era. At the start of the game, you randomly place player tokens on these spaces on the board. If there's only 2 or 3 players, then you place one of these tiles that only has 3 or 2 player spaces. These tokens mark the turn order. So here it's blue first, green second, pink third. The first player to pass moves their token down to the first space here and scores the points on the space. So the first player to pass here scores 5 points, the second player scores 2 points, and none for the third player to pass. This takes the player's token out of the turn order, so they don't get any more turns during the era. When everyone has passed, that ends the actions phase, and then after you do all of the other end of era scorekeeping things, then you choose player order for the next era. Whoever was first to pass gets to choose which spot they want for the next era. So pink passed first, maybe they want to be last player in the next era, so they're the last player to place citizens on hills. And then the second player who passed chooses a space, and so on. So, now you've seen all of the game's main actions, let's walk through the entire era. This track on the bottom of the board is the phases of the era. You move the ship token along to each phase as you do each phase. So you start each era on drafting cards. You get 3 monuments and 2 provinces of the era. You draft down to 4 cards, and the 5th card goes in the spaces on the board. Phase B is the actions phase. Players take turns taking actions as shown on the turn order area. So this is blue, then green, then pink, then back to blue, and so on. Your player aid card also shows the actions you can take on your turn. You can play a card from your hand, play a personality on the board, or construct a building, pay wheat to take a hill, or pass for the round, or pass for the era. Once you pass, which means you're done taking actions for the era, you're out of the turn order, and this phase ends when everyone has passed for the era. Then the next 4 phases, C, D, E, F, have to do with the hills. Phase C is scoring the hills. The prefect of each hill, the player on the left space, scores the biggest points reward on each hill. The second and third players score the second and third highest scores. Phase D is the devastation phase, where some hills get worse. If you look on the icon for devastation on the phase track, it has this X icon and players -1. So you need to devastate a number of hills equal to the number of players -1. So here's a board for a 3-player game, so we need to devastate at least 2 hills. Let's hide this quick. So on these hills I count 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, and 1, 2. So this middle hill has the most citizens with 3 citizens. We cover its top space with a devastation token, and green is prefect here, so green gets 2 unrest. Then there's 2 hills tied for second most with 2 citizens each. How do we break the tie between them? Trick question. We don't. I said that at least 2 of the hills get devastated for a 3-player game, so both hills tied for second and get a devastation token. And then red is prefect here, and green is prefect here, and they both gain 2 unrest. So this middle hill used to be 6 points for the prefect and 4 points for second place. Now it's worth 4 points and 2 points for the next era. And if this hill gets devastated again next era, then it's going to end up being just worth 2 points for the prefect in the third era. Then there's 2 more phases for the hills. Phase E is buildings. There's a temple on this hill, and green is the prefect here, so green scores the points bonus under the temple. So green got blamed for devastation and gained unrest twice, but at least they still controlled the temple. And then phase F says all citizens on the game board go back to their owner's player boards, including the citizens on the building actions. Phase G is unrest. You look at your token on the unrest track. For every token on your space or below you, you either pay the cost on the token or you gain a doom token. Phase H is feeding. For each citizen on your player board, you pay 1 wheat or gain 2 unrest. And then Phase I has these 4 icons for the end of the era. The first icon says, we're switching to the next era of cards. Players must discard all unplayed cards of the current era, including the personalities and leftover cards on the board. You then draw 2 personality cards from the next era and place them on the board, or just 1 for a 2-player game. The second icon is all of the reward tokens. Slide back up so you see the thumbs up on the bottom of the space. The third space is this, which means you turn back up all of your activation cards that you rotated to use for once in each round. And then the fourth space is you choose the turn order for the next era. Whoever passed first gets to move their token to any turn order space, and then the second person who passed, and then the third person who passed, and so on. And that's turn order for the next era. And that's the end of the era. You then move this ship token back to Phase A, and you begin the next era. So, it's the final lesson. At the end of Era 3, you skip Phase I, all of the end of era stuff. You flip over your player aid card and it shows the endgame scoring on the back. You gain 1 prestige point for each 1 stone, 2 wheat, or each 8 money you have remaining, rounded down. You score the points on the rewards of each card that you played this game. Then you stack all of your cards into sets of different types, the colors on the bottom of the card. You score 3 or 9 points for stacks of 6 or 7 different types. You can have multiple stacks of cards, but each card can only go in one stack. Then you look at the unrest track. You first place your unrest token beside the penalty that's across from your space. Then for each doom token you have, you move your token to the next penalty, not just the next square space on the track. And then you lose the points on the penalty where you end up. If you end up on the last penalty, then the rulebook says that your family is condemned to damnatio memoriae? Anyway, and finally, the player with the most prestige points wins the game. If there's a tie, then, well, your family's names appear the same number of times in all the history books, so you just have to share the victory. And that is Aeterna. If you can't decide which cards to draft in the first era, you might want to look for monument cards with permanent or activation bonuses that can help you out for the rest of the game. You may also want to look at the personality cards on the board and see if you can take actions to match their rewards. Don't forget that you can discard the cards that you can't play to get free resources as shown on your player aid card, and you get bonus money when you play cards of the same set color. And if you're going to play cards that give you more citizens, then don't forget that those citizens may need to eat at the end of the era. That's the end of this board game textbook, How to Play video. Thank you for watching. Y'all take care.